Welcome back, history lovers. It's good to have you back with me. If you followed along with us in the last lecture, you heard me introduce you to ancient American civilizations that had taken root and really become advanced and complex long before Europeans started showing up. Today what we're going to do is we're going to emphasize those individuals that are going to be to the north of what I could refer to as Mesoamerica. These are going to take root in what would become the countries of the United States and Canada. And one of the things that you're going to find out are these societies are going to be very different than the groups that we talked about the last time. If you recall, both the Mayans and the Aztecs really emphasized what we'll call a stratified society, meaning that there were people that had accumulated a lot of wealth, and with that wealth came a lot of power, and they used both that wealth and power to really dictate terms to those people underneath them. I had made mention that if you wanted to compare the Mayan civilization to an ancient European civilization, look to the Romans. They had a lot more in common with the Romans than what you typically think of when you hear the terms Native American. Now, today what we're going to talk about are groups of people that are going to be very different than those Mesoamerican societies. And by that, I mean their numbers are just smaller. There's no two ways about it. There are fewer of these societies, well, maybe not societies, but fewer in terms of population than what you would find in Mesoamerica. They're also much more willing to share power. Now, there's a reason for this, and it has nothing to do with the fact that they were better people or they wanted to treat their people better. It had everything to do with necessity. As I said during the last lecture, it's just easier to make a living in Mesoamerica. The growing season's longer, the climate is not as harsh, it's easier to exist there. If you want to survive in what would become New York State or even Northern California, that's going to mean cooperating and depending on groups of people. Some of those people you're going to see as your kinspeople and some of them not. But in any case, it will emphasize the sharing of power in order to achieve the common goal of survival. So with that being said, I want to introduce you to some of these groups. Before we go ahead and do that, though, let me make sure that you understand what I expect of you. I'm not asking you to memorize each and every one of these groups. To do that would be nearly impossible, at least in my opinion. What I'm emphasizing here are big picture sorts of issues, and when and where there's a term that's really important, I'll try to do my best to underline and highlight that. But the way that this is going to unfold is I'm going to take you from the eastern chunk of the North American continent to the far west coast. And we're going to begin with the Algonquian peoples. Now, there's one thing that I want to emphasize before we go any further, and you're going to see this come again and again in our lecture. The Algonquians were not a nation. You think of a nation like France. That's not what the Algonquians were. What they were was a group of people that spoke the Algonquian language, and to a lesser extent they practiced Algonquian culture. Religions, ways of looking at the world, they were very similar, different wrinkle here and there, but generally speaking they were pretty similar. It's not a nation like you think of a modern day nation. There were boundaries, and a lot of times these boundaries changed. They evolved. And so when Christopher Columbus came to the Americas in 1492, what he saw was a picture that had been changing and transforming for generations and generations. But for our purposes, the Algonquians are going to really come to dominate a chunk of the North American continent. Think about the eastern middle Atlantic seaboard, Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, all the way to the Great Lakes regions, and even further south than that. So a very big swath of the North American empire. Now, whereas the Mayans had built these impressive cities like Tikal or Palenque, whereas the Aztecs had cities like Tenochtitlan, the Algonquians were predominantly organized at the village level, much, much smaller village units than what we've talked about in Mesoamerica. Now that's actually very important. We're talking about a hunter-fisher sort of societies. Subsistence farming as opposed to the Mayans that grew for these urban marketplaces. It's important that you understand that the Algonquians were basically villagers because when the English started showing up in the 1580s and certainly thereafter, they're going to notice that the natives were organized at a village level. And England at the time was also organized at a village level. Those native societies grew corn for subsistence. The English societies where these immigrants were coming from, they grew wheat at a village level, at a subsistence level. So my point is, there's going to be a natural bond between the English and these indigenous peoples that they'll bump into at the East Coast, and village life has a lot to do with that. There's something else that I want you to understand before we go any further as well, and it's the myth of what I call the ecological Indian. The idea that Native Americans never did anything to alter their surroundings or change the natural scope of the land as Mother Nature had intended. It's complete mythology. It's just fiction as far as I'm concerned. The people that lived in what would become North Carolina, the Outer Banks of North Carolina, they had a system for clearing forests when it comes to making arable farmland. It was known as slash and burn. They would just torch a forest and they would chop down the remaining stumps of what was left. And this was good for a number of different reasons as far as farmers were concerned. But number one, that was a very efficient way of clearing land. And number two, just like anybody that's ever studied horticulture or, sophisticated forms of farming, you can tell me that by releasing those carbons through the process of burning, what you're basically doing is fertilizing the soil. Not to mention creating more sunlight by taking down those ancient trees. The Algonquians did this. This was nothing new to them. They knew how to not only harness, but really exploit their natural surroundings. So the idea that Native Americans, including but not limited to the Algonquians, just never altered their surroundings is nothing more than fiction. And it's important for us to take that into consideration. There was some misunderstanding when it comes to how Algonquian society functioned, and the English are going to find this out very quickly. When the English were trying to really establish their societies, they went to the male leaders of these Algonquian nations, and they would ask them how much they would like for this plot of land. Now, that was a problem in and of itself because the Native American way of thinking about the land, it wasn't really that you could own it. You had a right to work on it. You had a right to harvest the fruits of your labor, but you really couldn't own it in the way that the English had thought about that. But even more problematic is they went to the men. The men were not in charge of the land. The English, like many Western European civilizations, were a paternal society, meaning that when you inherited land, when you bought land, you bought it from your father. You inherited it from your father. That was not the way that things were done in the Native American world. You inherited land from your mother. And when I say inherited it, what I mean is you had the right to work upon it. And Algonquian women were responsible for producing 90% of the Algonquian diet, fruits, vegetables, especially corn. But it was women that had that very, very important title and position. And consequently, the Algonquians, and it wasn't just the Algonquians, but certainly the Algonquians, treated Native women much, much more progressively than what European women would have been treated at a very similar time period. Okay? So, moving on, I also want to introduce you to a group that we'll call the Iroquois. And similar to the Algonquians, Iroquois is a language. It's not a nation like France is a nation. But in particular, the Iroquois consisted of 5 predominant groups, 5 predominant nations, if you will, that really did think of themselves as nations in the modern day sense. You've got the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Seneca, the Tuscarora, and together these are the predominant Iroquois nations, if you will. Now it's important that you understand that the Iroquois groups all thought of themselves as very independent and very exclusive, and those boundaries and borders, they mattered. And you've got a situation where you've got a lot of people living under one roof. And I shouldn't have to explain to you that any time you have a lot of different people, all of whom assume that they're very independent of each other, they have a problem getting along. Long story short, there was a series of vicious civil wars within this Iroquois network long before Europeans started showing up. Vicious civil wars that would just rage on for years and years and years. And not only was this devastating for Iroquois society, it was very difficult to really make heads or tails in terms of an economic setting, a political setting. So they had to find a way to get along. What they came up with would later become known as the Iroquois League. This is an early form of democracy. Now, the Iroquois League is certainly worth writing down, and an early form of democracy is also important to write down next to it. This was a power-sharing dynamic that would resemble what you and I would think of as the United Nations, the UN. A group of countries, all of whom are independent of each other, come together to iron out differences that they may have with one another. Each group is given an ample opportunity to air its grievances. Each group is given an opportunity to tell its side of the story. It's designed to head off problems before they become full-fledged wars. So by setting up this early form of democracy where all of these nations would have a chance to say their piece, the Iroquois had established a power-sharing dynamic which would have been very, very rare, almost unheard of in the Old World, certainly in Europe, but you might even make the case for Africa as well, the Middle East as well. So that's very unique, the sense that the Iroquois were setting up this early form of democracy. A subgroup of Iroquois-speaking people would be a group that would call themselves the Wyandotte. Now, again, Wyandotte was almost like a subgroup of a subgroup in the sense that they spoke the Iroquois language, but there were several different confederacies in the Wyandotte network, right? Now, the term Wyandotte in the Iroquois language means dwellers, livers of the peninsula. What peninsula? Think southeastern Ontario. If you think of Toronto today, that's the part of North America that I'm talking about. So it's a little bit west of the traditional nations of the Iroquois, all of whom had pretty much established themselves in what you call New York State. Now, similar to those five nations that we just got done talking about, the Wyandotte had trouble getting along. Yes, they all had a similar heritage and they spoke a similar language, but they thought of themselves individually. And so what they did was they set up a constitution. And what this constitution pretty much said was, here is who is in charge of what, and here is the extent of their power. Now, that ought to sound pretty familiar in the sense that that's pretty much exactly what the U.S. Constitution does. It says Congress, for example, has the power to levy taxes and raise revenue and spend money. The president's job, on the other hand, is to enforce laws. The judicial branch's job is to interpret the laws, say what those laws say. That's basically what the Wyandotte Constitution did. And its constitution, the use of a constitution, is a way to make peace and to make sense out of a chaotic world and to emphasize here's the structure, here's the order, here's in charge, so that we don't step on each other's feet for all this time, right? So another very important form of power sharing structure, the Wyandotte Constitution. Moving along, I want to introduce you to the Kusa, or the Kusa chiefdom. One thing I'll say about the Kusa before we go any further is by the time that Europeans, the Spanish, the English, and even the French had come to explore the North American continent, the Kusa had long gone away. They had gone extinct. The Kusa would be the ancestors of your more modern native groups, especially the Cherokee. But what I want you to understand about the Kusa is really two things. Number one, mound builders. They built these great mounds. Not necessarily temples, but they kind of look a little bit what you'd expect a temple to look like. And unlike the Algonquians or the Iroquois, the Kusa was much more of a stratified society in the sense that the guy that ruled over the Kusa chiefdom probably ruled at the top of that mound and kind of dictated his terms to those people below him. The other thing that I want you to understand about the Kusa is that they were great businessmen. And the reason that we know this is that there are things, there are commodities, metals too, that archaeologists on digs have found in those mounds that have long since been covered by grass and other forms of earth. Things like zinc and things like turquoise, copper. Now, none of those things that I just mentioned are indigenous to the part of North America where the Kusa had come to dominate, northwestern Georgia. They're not native to that. So you have to ask yourself the question, how did they get there? And the very simple answer is trade and trade networks. The Kusa were good to not only networking with people from faraway lands, but they were also very good at establishing trade routes and protecting those trade routes. If you think about the whole purpose of trade, trade this for that, it's because they have something that you want, and you have something that you have a high supply of. And so this is a way of raising the standard of living without really having to work so hard to do that. The Kusa had found a way to do that long, long before Europeans showed up and implemented a very different style of trading network. But one group that we'll call a member of the Mississippian peoples, people that occupied especially the southern and central part of the North American continent, they would develop a very large urban center that would come to be known as Cahokia. Now, for your notes, Cahokia was the largest urban center located in North America. I'm not including Mesoamerica in this conversation. We're not talking about Tikal or Tenochtitlan. Cahokia is going to be home to hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples before 1492. Much like the Kusa, what Cahokia would be good at would be trading with other peoples from distant lands. As a matter of fact, Cahokia, the reason that it was so well populated was because it was a center of commerce and trade. Over the course of time, it would become the capital of the Mississippian peoples. Much like the Kusa, by the time that Coronado or De Soto began to really make inroads into the exploration of the North American continent, Cahokia had been pretty much in decline and had gone away. If you look at the top of this slide here entitled Cahokia, you get an image of what we think it must have looked like before it had gone into such rapid decline. If you look at the image at the bottom of that, it's now covered in grass, and what archaeologists will do is they will dig deep into those grass-covered mounds, and they will pull out artifacts, many of which are not indigenous to that part of North America, which is why we believe that they Mississippian peoples were such good businessmen and women. Moving on, I want to introduce you to the Pueblo peoples. Now, the term Pueblo, it just really means Anasazi, and the term Anasazi, it's an anthropological term that emphasizes ancestral peoples. But really what I'm talking about are the peoples that would come to dominate the southwestern chunk of the North American continent. If you think Arizona, if you especially think New Mexico, that's the region of North America that I'm talking about. And if you think about that region of the continent, it's a very difficult place to live. Which means that you're going to depend on other people, both people that you would consider your kinsmen and people that you would not. In order to organize their societies to ensure survival, the Pueblos developed the notion of moiety or moieties. In the native language, this moiety translated into the term half, but what they really meant was during half of the year, one moiety, let's call them the summer moiety, would pretty much make the rules. They would pass laws, they would implement those laws, and they would enforce those laws. And when the fall gave way to the winter moiety, the second half of rulers, would have their day to implement laws and to enforce those laws and pretty much call the shots. So it was a power sharing structure, not unsimilar to what the Iroquois had going on back in the East. It was a way of making sense out of a world that a lot of times didn't make any sense. It's a very difficult place to make a living, and if you're going to do that, you're going to depend on your fellow kinsmen. It's not as simple as just some ruler in Palenque saying, I want 74 bushels of corn produced by the end of the day. It's not that simple. It's a very power sharing oriented society, the Pueblo society. Now, we've reached the West Coast, and there's literally a litany of different groups that we could talk about when it comes to emphasizing the way that the native people along the western coast of North America organize their life. But I'm really going to boil this down to two. The Northwest and maybe the central part of what is today California. Let's begin with the Northwest. One group that would really take deep root in what would become Washington State and even Oregon would be a group that we would call the Chinook Native American peoples. What they were very good at was fishing, and a lot of Chinook life really revolved around fishing. Not only fishing for subsistence, in other words, sustenance, but also for trade. The Chinook were, I suppose you could call them, a democratic-oriented group of people, certainly more so than the Aztec, but it wasn't that simple. There were ruling dynasties, for lack of a better way of putting it, dynasties in the sense that you had a ruling class of people that would pass power on to another group of people that would inherit that power. And the way that they kept track of all of this was through the use of a totem pole. Now, a couple things. Number one, a lot of modern-day Americans just kind of associate totem poles with any old group of Native Americans. This is something that's especially relevant to the Chinook peoples, but it's also very important when it comes to keeping track of who's in charge and the lineage of that power. It's never art for its own sake. It's always ways of keeping track of what's going on at any given time in Chinook history. The other group of people that I'd like to emphasize would be the Chumash. Now, this group is going to be located on the western edge of California, on the coastal line, right in the central part. The Chumash are going to become great voyagers and explorers. They're very widely known for their boats. If you're looking on that slide that's entitled The West Coast, at the bottom of that slide you see a group of natives that are pushing off into the shore, getting ready to go on this great voyage. The other thing that's important to consider here is you think of California, especially modern-day California, you think of this Garden of Eden. There's these agricultural crops that will only grow in California. It's got this very unique ecology, and everything from wine to cheese to nuts to all kinds of different exotic crops, citrus fruits. They grow in California. But it's also, much like the southwestern part, the Pueblos, it can be a very difficult, capricious place to live. And because it can be, you've got these periods of feast or famine, it can be very difficult to organize stable food sources. And what the Chumash developed to really shore up that unpredictability was the importance of trade. And so those canoes, although they're very iconic and they're very fun to look at for their own sake, they really do have a utilitarian purpose. We think that the Chumash would venture out on the Pacific Ocean 20, 30 miles outside of the coastline to trade with those dotting islands that run the western edge of the West Coast. And so this importance of trade is really a critical part to Chumash life, because without it, it's not a given that you are going to have a stable society. So this is a situation where you depend heavily on your surrounding peoples, and they depend heavily on you. It's not as simple as we'd like to make it out to be, hunting for buffalo or, growing crops, the ecological Indian. And I want to put sort of a conclusion on this. Now, I do not expect you to write down every single word up there, although you can if you want it. You can just simply download the PowerPoint. But there's really two things that I want to emphasize before we go any further. Technically three. Number one, as this video has demonstrated, Native North America was very, very diverse. There were different forms of economies, different forms of spiritualities, different forms of sharing the power and the power dynamic in life in Native North America. Number two, democracy. I've shown you numerous very different ways of spreading power much more evenly throughout the society as opposed to the groups that we talked about in Mesoamerica. Whether we're talking about the Iroquois League, or the Wyandotte Constitution, or the Pueblo moieties, or even something as simple as trade with the Chumash, we are talking about a much more evenly spread power dynamic, and it's got everything to do with necessity. It's not as easy to get along in North America as it would be in Mesoamerica, so it's out of necessity as opposed to anything else. Lastly, the American exception. One thing that I really want to emphasize about this is that Native Americans do directly influence this notion that we have of American exceptionalism. It doesn't have anything to do as much as racial and ethnic diversity as it does to the way that they practice their lives on an everyday basis. Whether we're talking about village life or power sharing or their treatment of women, ultimately this would make a very deep and profound impression on the French and especially the English North American colonists. The French in particular were very impressed with the Iroquois League at a time when democracy was just beginning to be tossed around in continental Europe. And so I'm hopeful that you can see that Native American ways of life, whether we're talking about Mesoamerica or whether we're talking about what you think of North America, were directly responsible for influencing what might loosely become known as American political thought. And so that's where we're going to leave it for right now. When we return, we're going to talk about the intertangling of the European, African, and North American continents. But for right